As I say, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Graham back formally to speak to us about what has happened 2023, but much more on what we might possibly expect in 2024. So, Graham, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gillian, and it's lovely to be back at Aquarius Severn, which is kind of my spiritual home in a way. Right, so I am going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that and hear me. So I'm going to do this in the way that often Chris and I have done it over the last goodness knows how many years. I'm sure we've been doing this in January for at least 15 years, maybe even longer, sort of stretching back into the dawn of time, it feels like. So I'm going to start with just what we normally do is just talk a little bit, very briefly, about the outer planet context. So rather than looking straight at a review of 2023 and looking ahead at 2024, as we know in astrology, this is all about cycles, planetary cycles, and the patterns that they weave as they orbit the sun, and from our perspective, as they go through the zodiac. And particularly the slower outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they take a long time to go round the zodiac. Uranus takes 84 years, Neptune about 140 years, and Pluto about 248 years. So they're very slow moving, and they spend, and because of that, they spend a lot of time in a sign. So, Pluto, and by the way, we know there are planets beyond Pluto. There are dwarf planets, so-called, beyond Pluto, such as Eris. But I personally don't feel I've kind of got to grips with those planets yet. So I stick to the, in quotes, traditional modern planets, outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which I'd say most astrologers have used certainly in the 20th century, and most astrologers use them now. Even though Pluto is regarded by astronomers as a dwarf planet, but we regard it as a planet in astrology. So it is currently in Capricorn, and it's been in Capricorn since 2008. And almost as soon as Pluto went into Capricorn, we had the Lehman Brothers financial debacle, which escalated into a full-scale global financial disaster, really, from which we're not fully recovered in many ways. However, last year it peeped into Aquarius, and very soon, as we'll see shortly in this presentation, it's going to go back into Aquarius. And apart from a few months later this year, it will remain in Aquarius until about 2043, 2044. So it's really quite a big deal astrologically when Pluto changes sign. The themes of the time change. And if you like, Pluto in Capricorn, well, it's felt, on the feeling level, it's felt to me like a very long, slow grind through Capricorn. I don't know what it feels like to other people. But there have been themes of, financial and economic transformation. We felt it in this country, and of course many other countries have suffered from Pluto having an effect in Capricorn. But it's moving into Aquarius. It's a shift from an earth sign to an air sign. And I'll talk a little bit more about air signs in a minute. But it's a shift from kind of the heavy material sense of Earth to the lighter element, the more free-flowing element of air. Right, and the Neptune, it's currently in Pisces. It's been in Pisces since around 2012. And looking forward to next year and the year after, it too shifts sign. So it's going to move into Aries, a fire sign. So it's moving from water to fire. And it's going to remain there till 2038, 2039. So many, many years. And Neptune in Aries, Neptune currently in Pisces, it's slightly difficult, as it always is with Neptune, to get a kind of grip or handle on it. But one thing I suggest that it's brought is well, one of many things is Netflix, and the kind of almost explosion of access to stories that we have through streaming TV, and also a tendency to escapism and illusion as well, and delusion. But that's going to change, not this year, but next year. And then finally, Uranus is going to move again next year and 2026 into Gemini, again into an air sign like Aquarius. So all three outer planets are this year and next year and the year after changing. And they're all changing from yin signs, in other words, either the earth or water element, which is both of which are yin in a sense that they are kind of inward moving, downward moving, feminine in inverted commas, and they're moving into yang signs, which are the element of air and fire. And yang has an outward going energy, a kind of brighter energy, whereas yin is darker and more inward moving and more reflective. So it's going to be a real change of the feeling tone, of the atmosphere of the world, I suggest. Casting my mind back to 1984, Pluto and Neptune changed from yang to yin signs that year. And I certainly noticed the change in atmosphere. It suddenly felt kind of darker and more inward moving, downward moving, if you like. Certainly not bad, or it's nothing to do with good or bad. It's just different. But I found it very noticeable, that shift in atmosphere. So I think it's going to be very interesting in the next couple of years. So I'd suggest you all keep your feelers out for the atmosphere of the times and how it's changing. So that's what we call the ingresses. In other words, a planet moving or ingressing into a new sign. Now, the other thing with the outer planets is that they make aspects to each other. And they do that all the time, of course. And the outer planet aspects are particularly interesting from a mundane astrology point of view. And by mundane, I don't mean boring. I mean mundane as in the sense of about the world. So mundane astrology is the astrology of world events. And when outer planets, and I'm including Jupiter and Saturn as well here, make aspects with each other, you often see some kind of event or major change in the world. And just going back a few years, of course, because we've been talking about this for a long time, both since and before 2020, we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in January 2020. So Saturn takes about 29 and a half years to go around the zodiac. And every, I think it's 40 years or so, may not be right about that, it crosses or conjuncts Pluto. So this is a cycle that happens once every 40 or so years. And it happened in January 2020. We were looking forward to it, again, inverted commas, because we knew it could be somewhat grim. And it took place in Capricorn. And it was quite a big deal, particularly as it took place in Capricorn. It almost compounded the symbolism of Saturn, Pluto, hardness, of coldness, of limitation, restriction. And then we had a series of Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions in 2020. And then at the end of 2020, on the winter solstice, we had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. We have those every 20 years. This one was particularly significant because it began it was the first, well, the second one actually, but it marked the shift from conjunctions in earth signs to conjunctions in air signs. And that is a major shift, which happens every 200 years. So it marked the beginning, if you like, of the age of air for the next 200 years. So again, another shift from earth and kind of materialism and money and work and time and all that sort of thing to air, which is a bit more free-flowing, intelligent. It has the potential to be more enlightened, and it's more communicative, and it's more about human connections and also technology. And then in 2021, we had a series of Saturn-Uranus squares, which for me had the effect of causing a certain amount of havoc with supply chains. And we saw that throughout that year, kind of disruption of supply chains. And then in 2022, we had a Neptune-Jupiter conjunction in, I think it was February 2022 in Pisces. Now, we all expected that to be lovely and beautiful and spiritual and peaceful and visionary. But instead, a war started, the war in Ukraine, which started with the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And so completely not what I expected, for sure, from an astrological point of view for that time. Things happening in, Jupiter, Neptune in Pisces suggests a lack of boundaries. So, I was kind of fearful that this thing would spread. Luckily, it hasn't spread, and I'm crossing my fingers. But it's kind of not what we expected. But nonetheless, it was a significant event that happened very close to that conjunction. And then this year, we're going to have a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, as we're going to see. And then casting a little bit further ahead to next year, we've got several Saturn-Uranus sextiles, and we've got Uranus-Neptune sextiles. And Uranus-Neptune sextiles are perhaps a little bit more significant because those two planets are further out than Saturn. So those are going to be interesting, and we will touch on them in forthcoming talks, no doubt. And then a kind of big astrological event in 2026 is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And it's big because it happens at 0 degrees Aries, which is symbolically the very beginning of the zodiac. So it almost has a sense of being a reset or a fresh start or a new beginning. And again, we will be coming back to that. And then we've got something very interesting in 2026, which I have Dan Waits to thank for alerting me to this. And Dan Waits is a brilliant astrologer who does really good YouTube videos. And Aquarius Severn invited him on my recommendation to speak last, I think it was September or July last year. He gave a really good talk. So anyway, that's the outer planet context. Now, having a quick review of last year, and I'll keep it very brief. So last year, the only real main astrological aspect was a Jupiter-Pluto square, which isn't particularly significant from my point of view, partly because Jupiter is fairly quick moving relative to the other outer planets. I take more note of Jupiter aspects in the sky if they're repeated. So these aspects can happen once, or they can happen 3 times. They can even happen 5 or 7 times. And as we'll see later on, they can even happen more times than that. But that's extremely unusual. Usually it's once or 3 times as a planet goes forward, crosses another planet, or makes an aspect to a planet, and then it retrogrades back, makes the aspect again, and then finally moves forward again and makes the 3rd aspect. But this one was just one aspect. Now, what happened during last year? Very briefly. So we started the year with the Ukraine war rumbling on in a kind of stalemate, which it's been in throughout 2023. In February, we had the very strange and unusual phenomenon, which to me was like a foretaste of Pluto in Aquarius, which is we had this very odd balloon floating across, I believe it was Alaska, and people got very agitated about this because nobody knew what it was, where it had come from, or what it was doing. And it felt somewhat threatening. And I imagine if you lived underneath it, you might have felt a bit more threatened by it. But it was kind of mysterious. And I don't know if it was actually officially acknowledged by the Chinese that it was one of their weather balloons, but I think that's what people believe it was in the end. But you could see the kind of satellite technology held underneath the balloon as it floated around the world. In January, there were protests back in January, I should say, over the raising of the pension age in France, and that those protests went on for many months throughout last year. In February, and I looked on Google Trends for this, there was a spike in searches for ChatGPT. So it's when ChatGPT really hit the public consciousness last year. ChatGPT being an example of generative AI, which is kind of technology that it is where computers are trained on vast amounts of data, be it text or images. And I put into an image AI called DALL-E 3. I said, draw an image of AI in 2023. So I thought this was quite a good image, really. It's a typical kind of AI image, and typically of AI image makers like DALL-E and Midjourney, which you may have heard of as well. It's not very good at handling text, so it's added an extra 2 to the year. So this looks like the year, well, whatever it is, 20,223. Anyway, so in May, the World Health Organization announced the end of the pandemic. And in May, we also had the coronation of King Charles III, which, weirdly, like most royal events, seems to happen very close to an eclipse. This time it was a lunar eclipse, which it was in Scorpio Taurus. And of course, it was fairly close. I think it was about 8 degrees from King Charles's own sun, which was interesting. So many United Kingdom royal family links with eclipses. And then in June, there was the Wagner Group attempted insurrection in Russia, which failed basically. But it had some popular support. People came out in the areas of Russia that the tanks were rumbling through, and a lot of people were, visibly welcoming them. So it's definitely unnerving the Russian High Command. In June, there were many heat waves around the world. Also in June, we had the tragedy of the Ocean Gate Titan submersible, which killed the 5 people that were in it, including the billionaire, who I can't remember his name, it's Richard Stockton something, Stockton Rogers maybe, behind Ocean Gate, and I believe his son as well, who was also in the craft. So it was going down to the wreck of the Titanic, and it collapsed. It couldn't withstand the pressure. Horrible event. Then in July, we had the Hollywood actors and writers strike, with the stage actors, the Screen Actors Guild, going on strike, partly because of the threat of AI replacing actors in future. And that rumbled on for many months. In July, we had the Barbenheimer phenomenon, which was a weekend when 2 blockbuster movies were released, Barbie and Oppenheimer. And in August, we had the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, and he was the guy who led the Wagner Group, who led the insurrection in Russia. And he was in a plane and it was blown out of the sky. Nobody owned up to doing that, but it kind of obviously fitted in with a revenge narrative at the time. But I don't think anybody knows. In August, there were deadly wildfires in Hawaii. And in October, we had the terrible terrorist event in Israel when about 1,200 people were killed, murdered, and about 240 people were taken hostage, Israelis and foreign nationals. Yeah, a really shocking event. And of course, after that, we've had this terrible destruction in Gaza with many people killed. I think currently about 22,000 people have been killed, 2/3 of whom are women and children. And yeah, I'll show a chart of that in a minute. Then in November, Sam Bankman-Fried, who is head of a cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, was convicted under 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy to fraud. And this isn't particularly newsworthy, but I found it rather odd, is that the head of OpenAI, who the company that created ChatGPT, quit suddenly. The board basically, the board seemed to chuck him out. And then it all got very strange. And then the board, lots of people said they were going to leave the company if Sam Altman was no longer to be its head. And they accused the board of a coup. And then various members of the board said they were going to quit. And then a week later, Sam Altman was invited back. And there was a new board. It was all rather peculiar. But anyway, that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of that year. Now, that event in October the 7th, that was a terrible event. And it's the kind of event that I would expect astrology to flag up in advance. You know, many significant events in my lifetime have correlated to significant astrological patterns. For example, the fall of the Berlin Wall, a Saturn-Neptune conjunction with Jupiter simultaneously opposite in Cancer. And, you know, for me, that was such an interesting experience to watch the events play out as I was looking at the ephemeris and looking at the patterns in the sky that were playing out at the same time. And then 9/11, we had Saturn opposite Pluto. So, events of these kind of magnitude that have such an emotional impact and hit the headlines, I kind of, they're generally seen in the sky. But the October the 7th attack, um, it doesn't correspond with an outer planet event. However, a week before the October the 7th attack, I was looking at a video by Steve Judd, who is a very good astrologer on YouTube. He does videos regularly, once every few days, and has done for years. And he said that he pointed out that he expected the weekend of October 7th, 8th, I think it was, to be, I can't remember the words he used, but I think he said bloody, horrible, difficult, because Mars in Libra, as it was then, was going to square Pluto in Capricorn. So Mars around October 7th was about 27 degrees Libra in the sign of its detriment. So it's not happy, not it's not necessarily happy in Libra, was squaring or 90 degrees to Capricorn. Now that is a difficult aspect. It is an aspect which happens, well, I can't remember now, once a year, once every 2 years or something. Mars square Pluto, symbolically can be, it can be very passionate, it can be very intense, it can sometimes be even violent. Every aspect has a spectrum of possibilities, and the kind of worst possibilities of Mars Pluto is that it can be violent and bloody even. But of course, you can have it in a natal chart, and it can mean that you have access to really strong sense of power, personal power, and assertiveness, which, when harnessed, can be very, very effective and transformative. But it can have this difficult side as well. Anyway, it was square. They were squaring each other on that weekend, and when this attack happened, I looked back at the ephemeris and I thought, well, okay, there's a Mars Pluto square. That's difficult, but is it significant enough of an aspect to link it to the horrible events of that weekend? Maybe not. But I noticed that I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I've got the chart. No, I haven't got the chart here of that. Whoops. So I'm trying to go back. There we go. I'm not sure I've got the chart of that actual attack, but Mars at 27 degrees Libra, it was within 6 or so degrees of the eclipse, the solar eclipse that was going to happen a week later on October the 14th. So that made me wonder, and this is just me wondering, thinking out loud, as I did at that moment, whether such an aspect might be magnified, one, by one of the planet's proximity to the actual eclipse in terms of proximity within the zodiac. 6 degrees is, it's fairly close. And two, by its proximity in time. So it made me wonder whether aspects in the sky aren't amplified or exaggerated or intensified by being near in time to an eclipse. And I just think maybe that's something for us to all think about and observe, and particularly when eclipses come up this year, as they do every year. Okay, so and also I thought, well, I'll look at the chart of Israel, and if I just go back here, Uranus was at 22 degrees Taurus, and when Israel was proclaimed as independent by Ben-Gurion, who I think was the prime minister or president of Israel, as it became at this moment, he proclaimed it independent. The actual birth of Israel is quite complicated. I'm not very good at history, but the League of Nations, I think, wanted to create two states, Israel and Palestine. And Britain at the time had the mandate to govern Palestine as it was from the 1920s. And around this time, 1948, there was a lot of violence as people tried to create their own state. And Israel declared its own state on May the 14th, 1948. So it's a very accurate chart for that moment. So it has the sun at 23 degrees Taurus. I'm just going back to the eclipse chart. Uranus is at 22 degrees Taurus. So Uranus is just about to cross Israel's sun. Now, it does that once every 84 years. And Israel is kind of crossing and recrossing Israel's sun this year. So it suggests Uranus is the planet of freedom, liberation, sudden events, shock, intervention, technology. So it suggests, a sudden change, possibly a sudden change of direction for Israel, sudden events impacting Israel, shocking events potentially. So that's all I can offer with regard to that event, and I'd love to hear what other people, insights that other people have had into that event. Anyway, moving on, and there's also a chart of the Palestine independence, which I just included, which we can come back to later if necessary. Now, 2024, this is just shows the range of motion of the planets throughout the year. So it just shows you how far they move throughout the year. So starting with the outermost planet, Pluto, it moves just within a short span, 3 degrees, from late Capricorn to early Aquarius. Neptune remains at the end of Pisces, Uranus in late Taurus, as we've just seen. Saturn remains in Pisces, so it moves about 15 degrees. And Jupiter starts in Taurus and ends in Gemini. And I've also included Ceres up here. We don't often talk about Ceres, a dwarf planet. I can't remember if it's just outside the orbit, between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, I believe. And it has connections with food. Ceres, the goddess of crops and vegetation, from which we get the word cereal. And it moves quite quickly, so it starts in Sagittarius, ends up in Aquarius. And then I've also included the moon's north nodes. Now, they're not physical objects that you can see in the sky. They're symbolic objects, if you like. But they are points in the zodiac that move around the zodiac and that we as astrologers take note of. And the north node, which is this one, is always opposite the south node, which is this one. So the north node is going through Aries at the moment, and obviously the south node directly opposite is going through Libra. So just to note that the physical objects, Ceres up to Jupiter, they're all occupying about 180 degrees of the chart. So they're on this side of the chart. So there's nothing kind of the outer planets that are physically on this side of the chart. Right, now, this isn't a major event, but I just thought I'd flag it up because it's of interest. The Sun conjuncts Pluto. It does that every year on a particular day. But it's going to do it this year at 29:49 degrees Capricorn, the very end of Capricorn. And the very next day, Pluto moves into Aquarius. So I just wondered, I just think we ought to all keep an eye out on the news that day. Is there going to be some kind of last blast event of Pluto being in Capricorn? Some last banker that gets, I don't know, put in prison for crimes and misdemeanors, or some last corruption scandal, or some last abuse of governmental or economic power. So the next day, Pluto enters Aquarius. Hooray, I think. Because, as I say, for me, it's been a long, slow trudge through Capricorn. So shift in atmosphere. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't stay in Aquarius all the year. In October and November, I think, can't remember the exact dates, but for about 1.5 months, it dips back into Capricorn, and thereafter it's in Aquarius until 2038, I think it was, or 2043, a long time anyway. So Pluto shifting into Aquarius. So themes of technology, people power as opposed to governmental and corporate power, the power of technology for good and bad, artificial intelligence, the power of that, and that is obviously going to become more powerful. It's going to have more of an influence over people's lives, again, for good, possibly bad as well. Greater connectedness between people. Obviously, we've seen that from the dawn of the internet, but I think that's going to happen even further. And hopefully, potential greater intelligence in the way we live our lives and the way countries, the world is run. Hopefully, I can only hope. Then we have a penumbral lunar eclipse on the 25th of March, which will be visible in United Kingdom at 5 degrees Libra. Now, just a brief word about eclipses. I think eclipses are interesting. I mentioned the solar eclipse of last October. For me personally, they intensify things. They shine a light on things. Just to give you a little personal story, because if you have an eclipse, like a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, close, particularly if it's conjunct within 1 or 2 degrees of one of your birth planets, then I think you notice it. I had a few years ago, I don't know, about 6, 7 years ago, there was a lunar eclipse on my Mars. I've got Mars in Libra. And for some reason, I can't remember what it was now, I was seething. I was angry about something somebody had done or said to me. And I remember walking along a very nice street in my hometown of Cheltenham. And this young man walked towards me. I was walking on the pavement, or sidewalk, as Americans call it, and just minding my own business. And this young guy came up to me, and I kind of moved out of his way because he was sort of coming towards me, and I moved towards a fence that was on my railing that was on my right, and he moved closer towards me. And as he passed me, he bashed my shoulder with his deliberately. I just couldn't believe it. So I said, I turned around and said, "Hey, why did you do that?" And he didn't turn around. He just made a rude sign at me and carried on walking. But I thought, in a way, it was kind of amusing because I thought it was it was a very eclipse experience. He was almost a projection of what I was feeling like inside. And I think that's another thing that can happen on a personal level with eclipses. So if you've got anything around 5 degrees Libra, just take note of what's happening. Okay, so this is a solar eclipse. This is a beautiful diamond ring effect that we have on a solar eclipse when the moon passes in front of the sun. And just to flag up, as I have said in the past, it is such an interesting coincidence that from our point of view on Earth, the moon looks as though it's the same size as the sun. Hence, we get this extraordinary phenomenon. Now, that is an extraordinary coincidence. Obviously, the moon is a lot smaller. but because it's closer, it appears to be the same size. So this is the total solar eclipse of the 8th of April. And it's going to be visible in the United States. So if you're in the USA, you'll be able to get your eclipse glasses out and look up and see the eclipse. Obviously, you can't look at it with the naked eye. And they're wonderful phenomena, as most of you will know if you've seen one. And this has been called the Great American Eclipse because it sweeps across America. And I think I have a little graphic that Chris created. So I'm going to have to stop sharing my presentation for a moment. I'm going to have to find that graphic, and then I'll show you a little animation of that happening. And I did have it set up. I hope I can find it. Yeah, here it is. Okay, right, now I could share my screen again. Right, now I hope you can all see that. So there's the shadow of the moon passing over the United States on the April of the Earth. So as the moon is blocking the light of the sun for a few minutes, really. I don't know how long, actually. Sometimes it's around half an hour, sometimes shorter than that, sometimes a bit longer. And so because it's passing over the United States, I would imagine that is going to have a particular effect within the United States. So I'm just, hopefully you can see this presentation again. Let me know if you can't. Yeah, so it's going to happen at 19 degrees, 24 minutes of Aries. So again, if you've got anything at that point, it might come under the spotlight of that eclipse. And I find that during solar eclipses, as with lunar eclipses, that again, the atmosphere changes, things get a bit more intense and heightened, and kind of things around one become a bit more kind of oddly symbolic. Yeah, I won't give another personal illustration because I've got loads of them and it will take up too much time, but strange things can happen under eclipses, put it that way. Interesting things. So there's the chart of that solar eclipse. So you can see sun and moon at 19 degrees Aries, and you can see where all the other planets are at that time. So none of the other planets are making a particular aspect to that eclipse. So that's one thing to note. There's the chart of the United States. So that eclipse is actually taking place within a degree of the United States Chiron. Chiron, the wounded healer. So one might look out for collective wounds of the United States to be really under the spotlight for some reason at that time. And I'm not sure how that play out, but I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on that. And of course, it will also be loosely opposite Saturn at 14 degrees, the United States Saturn, 14 degrees Libra as well. And sextiling United States Mars in Gemini. Okay. Now, this is the kind of main event of 2024, as Gillian mentioned at the beginning. So on the 21st of April, Jupiter conjuncts Uranus, and it does so once during the year. So it's not a 3 times or even 5 times transit. It's a once off. And it's at 21 degrees and 49 minutes of Taurus. And Jupiter and Uranus, which we're going to discuss, the planet of good fortune and opportunity, meeting the planet of innovation, freedom, shock, surprises, as I discussed earlier. And that's happening in Taurus, an earth sign, which has connections with, well, we'll discuss that later. I don't want to kind of do a spoiler. So here's the Jupiter Uranus conjunction timeline, and if you give it a 3-degree orb, then the conjunction is in operation throughout April and into the early part of May. And here again, you can see it in graphic ephemeris format with the two planetary lines crossing. So on the 23rd of May, there's a sextile between Jupiter and Neptune. Neptune will be at 29.5 degrees Pisces, Jupiter 29.5 degrees of Taurus. In Aquarius Severn's talk of January 2022, we did also mention that the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction of the early part of that year was likely to bring about inflation, and sure enough, it did. It took off very soon after the invasion of Ukraine. So I'm just wondering whether this sextile, which is the opening sextile in that cycle that began on that conjunction in 2022, whether we're going to get another kind of inflationary bump briefly. And I don't think it will be as dramatic as the conjunction, because sextiles are usually fairly, I won't say innocuous, but they are easier to deal with usually. And if you look at the world and what's going on in it at the moment, there are potential inflationary pressures caused by the attacks on ships going through the, I think it's the Arabian Gulf. And some shipping companies have stopped temporarily going through that Gulf because it's too dangerous. Now, if that continues, that could disrupt supply chains again, and so we might see inflationary pressures. But as I say, I don't think it will be as long-lasting or as dramatic as with the conjunction. And on the 25th of May, Jupiter enters Gemini, as we saw in that range of motion graphic earlier. And then 3rd of June, Jupiter trines Pluto. Jupiter trine Pluto has connotations of large-scale projects and events, grand ideas, big ideas, huge proposals, maybe even scientific breakthroughs, possibly, as these are in Aquarius and Gemini. Yeah, so a trine is a kind of flowing, fairly easy energy between the two planets. So it's kind of a positive relationship between those two planets. So this is a good time to begin something big. So if you're planning something or proposing something big, it's a good time in June. In July, Neptune goes stationary retrograde. So that means that it appears to come to a halt. If you could see it through a telescope night by night, it would get slower and slower, come to a halt on this date. And it's the beginning of its retrograde motion, where it appears to go backwards in the sky. And that happens at 29:55 Pisces, so very close to the very last minute of Pisces. It turns back and resumes its travel back through Pisces. In August, we've got a Jupiter-Saturn square, one of several, two this year. And this happens at 17 degrees Gemini and 17 degrees Pisces. And this planetary pattern or aspect is joined with, or joined by Mars, which is, I think, at about 18 degrees Gemini, so conjunct Jupiter. And also Venus is part of the mix because it's, I think, at 20 degrees, no, sorry, 19 degrees Virgo. So it's forming this, what we call a T-square pattern, which could be tricky in relationships. That time could be tension in relationships, possibly even partings, a certain amount of tension, I'd say. And there's a lot of tension between Mars-Jupiter conjunct, which really wants to get on with things and move quickly. And it's kind of being held back by that Saturn in Pisces, possibly a fearful Pisces. So there's a sense in which kind of fear might be holding back, or perhaps even other people's fears might be holding back one's own desire to forge ahead and even take risks with things. And then in 1st of September, Pluto re-enters Capricorn, as I mentioned before. So it goes back into Capricorn. On the 18th of September, there's a partial lunar eclipse at 25 degrees and 40 minutes of Pisces and Virgo. So the lunar eclipse will be in Pisces. The sun will be directly opposite at 25 degrees Virgo, and that will be visible in Britain. And then on the 2nd of October, there is an annular solar eclipse at 10 degrees and 3 minutes of Libra, and that will be visible in Chile and Argentina. And an annular solar eclipse is one where the moon is a little bit further away in its elliptical orbit from the Earth than it would be during a total solar eclipse. So because it's a little bit further away, it doesn't quite cover the disk of the sun. So you see a kind of ring of sunlight around the moon as it passes in front of it. And then on the 11th of October, Pluto goes stationary direct, so it turns and it begins its forward motion again, 39 Capricorn, so it's in the last degree of Capricorn. And then on the 19th of November, it re-enters Aquarius, where it will remain for many years. So that's, the final. So from 1st of early September through to the 19th of November, it's back in Capricorn. And then it's in Aquarius. I'm saying hooray, not that it's going to be a bed of roses, but because it's going to be a shift and a change and slightly less heavy. Then on the 8th of December, Neptune goes stationary direct. So it's finished its retrograde motion. It's pausing as it turns direct. This takes place at 27 degrees and 8 minutes of Pisces, so near the end of Pisces. And then on the 24th of December, we have the second of the Jupiter-Saturn squares, so Saturn, Pisces, Jupiter in Gemini, and this time Mercury is joining the pattern, and it's opposite Jupiter in Sagittarius and square Saturn. So again, Jupiter-Saturn squares, I don't give huge amount of, I don't feel they're that significant in mundane terms. To me, they're to do with kind of the way things are governed, and maybe, there'll be shifts in the way things are governed under these squares. But I don't think they're hugely impactful or dramatic. There's just a chart of the UK that I was going to maybe refer to later. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour, or kind of out of planet context, a review of last year, and then a tour of the main events astrologically of 2024. And finally, I mentioned at the beginning an unusual basket shape of planets coming up in 2026. So here it is between the 19th and the 23rd of July, 2026. And we've got 4 outer planets at 4 degrees of yang signs. So Pluto at 4 degrees Aquarius here, and then Neptune at 4 degrees Aries, Uranus 4 degrees Gemini, and Jupiter at 4 degrees of Leo. So you've got an opposition between Jupiter and Pluto, and then you've got these trines between Pluto and Uranus and Jupiter and Neptune. And then finally a sextiles between Pluto and Neptune, Neptune and Uranus and Jupiter. So it's quite a complicated pattern. And again, thanks to Dan Waits for pointing it out. Dan is an excellent astrologer who we invited to give a talk at Aquarius Severn back in the summer. And he noticed this unusual pattern that's going to happen. It is very rare, and certainly the trines and sextiles suggest a lot of harmony. It's difficult to know what it means, but it suggests to me the possible patterns of growth, shifts in consciousness. I mean, I don't think that we'll all spontaneously ascend or transcend or anything like that, but it does show kind of creative shifts in consciousness, in understanding. Uranus Neptune makes me think of virtual reality. The Uranus Neptune conjunction in around 1992, that was when people first started talking about virtual reality, and the technology for it became possible, although it was quite rudimentary then. And Uranus Pluto together often signify real creative changes within the collective. So the sense of things really shifting, changing, perhaps even opening up with Jupiter there. The Jupiter-Pluto opposition suggests things happening on a very large scale. I guess there's potential for abuses of power with that Jupiter-Pluto opposition, but they seem mitigated by the trines and sextiles to Neptune and Uranus. So it's going to be a very interesting time, something to look out for. And again, it's all in yang signs. So as I mentioned before, the outer planets are shifting from yin to yang over the next year or so. So that is a real shift in energy and a change in the atmosphere, the tenor of the times. And I think this is going to be very much connected with that shift, perhaps to a greater sense of energy, positivity, a sense that things can actually be done and be done quickly as well. That's all part of the mix. Okay, so thank you. And I'll now hand over to Gillian.
Thank you very much. Yes. Well, I'm going to do a little bit, and then I'm going to ask the rest of us to join in. This is going to be more of a participatory time that we're beginning to move towards. Initially, if you want to pop any comments on the chat, please do so, and we'll have a look at that. But yeah, so this most significant aspect of the year between these two outer planets, Jupiter and Uranus, in Taurus, it's the last year of Uranus in Taurus, and it'll take place, as Graham said, on the 21st of April. So Uranus has been in Taurus for some time, and one could begin to look at the Jupiter conjunction with it as something of a sort of rubber stamp, or more than that, an expansion or a confirmation of the effects of Uranus in Taurus. We might want to think back about what those may have been. Could there be some sort of expansion or magnification of those? But let's think about Taurus for a moment. It's a fixed earth sign. So the energies are steady and persistent. It's obviously very clearly associated with the earth. I mean, people heavy in Taurus energy, lots of links to the earth itself, farming, gardening, and so on. Steady, persistent, it's a sensuous sign. It's one which appreciates the real, very much embodied, and a very settled and steady sign. Appreciative of the material world, can be a little inquisitive. Obviously, the motto for Taurus is I hold. It relates in a way to that part of development of human beings where the child has realized that they are separate from their mother, that they are a unique, a different being, and they start to explore the world, and I want that. There can be a grasping energy there. But Taurus fundamentally values tried and tested ways. So that's one of the archetypes that we're looking at. We can return to this in a while. This is a chart for the event itself. You can see the circle there, circled. We've got Uranus, the glyph of Uranus and Taurus and Jupiter together. In terms of the aspects that they make, the strongest aspect is in fact a sextile, so one of excitable, stimulative energies with Mars. And Mars is in Pisces at that time, so its usual way of expressing itself is perhaps somewhat muted. But nevertheless, Mars aspects tend to be strong and can trigger and expand the basic aspect that they find themselves interacting with. That is the strongest aspect. The other, of course, is to the moon, which in a mundane chart represents the people. And those of you who have a much better background in mundane astrology than me might wish to say something about that trine, flowing energy, of course. The houses that we've got here, I've simply set this at 0 Aries because the rising sign for this particular chart is going to vary according to where you are in the world. So we will come back to that. But just note Venus is in detriment insofar as she's in Mars's sign. She's in Aries, so quite a fiery Venus there, very close to Mercury, communication. She's also quite close to being conjunct Chiron, which I didn't put on here. And Uranus itself, we know it's been in its fall right the way through its passage of Taurus. Let's have a think about those archetypes though. And this is really where in a minute I'd like to invite you. Jupiter is clearly known as the great benefic traditionally, and it's supposed to bring with it all sorts of wonderful things. It's certainly expansive. It grows things. It's the yearning for growth within the individual. And we'll go on to many more aspects of Jupiter. But let's just remember that growth and expansion uncontained is not always an unalloyed good. There may be negative consequences of growth as well. If growth gets out of hand and expansion gets out of hand. And we have Uranus, which is the great awakener, that part of the solar system that when it impacts on our own charts tends to wake us up and bash us slightly back onto the course that we are supposed to be. If we have moved away from our authentic selves, then Uranus can be something of an impetus to get us back on track. And sometimes that's not particularly comfortable, especially for those of us who like to stay in a nice, comfortable zone. those of us who aren't particularly keen on change, because Uranus can be sudden and unexpected change. It is meant to wake us up. But one of the things that comes to mind when we get Jupiter in conjunction with Uranus is, I hesitate to say this, but it is quite an explosive energy. It's quite, it suggests sudden changes, which may be for the good. I'll just bring in Taurus again for a moment. The energies of Uranus and Taurus are not particularly easy. Uranus changes things. It's rather unpredictable. And of course, Taurus is an earth sign that likes things to be steady as she goes. So those do pull apart. We might look over the last 6 years during which Uranus has been in this sign to see what has happened there. But before we go much further, I'd really like to hand over to you this image. I've pulled 2 images together that Chris was kind enough to send me. He was obviously going to do this part of the talk. And so there are some images here. I think you can guess which particular planet these images are supposed to represent. We have Father Christmas there. We have someone on the scales gaining weight. We have various touches to religion and belief. We've got some dice there and pictures of people gambling. So Jupiter is associated with taking a bet, with taking a big bet on yourself, actually. Classically, if Jupiter is in a particular house of your chart, it's time to question where you might be underestimating yourself and what is it that you might bet on. You might take a bet on yourself. Where do you need to have confidence and faith in yourself? But of course, you do have to do due diligence, as the great benefic can sometimes bring us things that are more glittery than golden. Got a number of other images here to do with religion. There's something there about hopefulness and belief, self-belief. I love the pictures of the balloons. Jupiter, the great expander. And of course, it is a gas giant itself. So there's something rather wonderful there about all those balloons rising into the air. Holidays, enjoying yourself, the religious image in the bottom picture as well. But please do feel free to pop in any other ideas about Jupiter that you have into the chat, and we'll have more of a general chat together in a minute about this as we move into the interactive part. The next series of images, again thanks to Chris, are intended to illustrate some of the aspects of Uranus, and I'm particularly drawn to that lightning strike on a mountain. The way in which Uranus acts is often very sudden and unexpected. Howard Sasportas, The Gods of Change, has got a lot to say about this planet and how it works, but it seems to be generally agreed that one of the things about a Uranus transit is that you cannot be too expect the unexpected. Basically, you cannot expect to be able to say exactly what's going to happen. What happens is going to be unexpected. But we've got other images here. The gentleman with his hair on end, I suspect he's standing on a Van de Graaff generator. Yes, electrification. Uranus is very much associated with the new, the shock of the new. It's quite iconoclastic. Iconoclastic, the breaking of icons, the breaking of what has been valued in the past. And there we get a particularly pertinent note of the energy with it in Taurus. Uranus is the planet of rebellion on the top picture there, we've got someone squaring up against the police. And there are a number of other images. I wonder if the picture of the black swan represents mutation. I'm not sure. We've got a variety of other images there. It's associated with technology. Graham showed us before that wonderful image, and the growth of AI and how artificial intelligence can support us with material things might be one area of one aspect of Uranus in Taurus. I understand that AI is currently being used to explore material science, and that a number of different possible combinations of materials have been found, and many of them over a very short period of time. And people are setting up experiments to see how these might work. Some hopes that they might help with battery technology, Taurus storage, maybe. So yes, high tech, but also a breaking apart of things, unexpected accidents, earthquakes even, although I think it would be interesting to do a technical study on quite how many earthquakes we have when Uranus isn't in Taurus, or when Uranus isn't in an earth sign, compared with when it is. I did once try to do that and then found it was far too much for me. But the shock of the new. Please do add anything that you'd like to on the chat. I shall have a look at the chat in a moment, and I will just finish this part by saying that if you want to have a think about how this particular conjunction might affect you personally, first of all, you'll want to look at the house of your own chart that it falls in, that 2150 Taurus falls within. So that should indicate the area of life which is being touched by Uranus and its breakthrough energies and the expansive energies of Jupiter. You could also look to see if it makes any aspects, particularly squares, oppositions, or conjunctions, to any of your own personal planets, or indeed ascendant, descendant, IC, MC. It's happening on my IC, and that I think could be interesting. But at this point, I think I'm going to stop the share and hand over and open my chat, and say thank you to everyone who's come today.